Hey guys, my name is Billy Wink. I'm the CEO of HV Auto, and I want to do an updated video of the common problems that we're seeing on the 997.1 Porsches. We used to see quite a few 997.1s, and as these cars have gotten older, a little bit less rotating through the shop, a little bit less coming through and selling them, and that's because of a number of reasons. And one of the primary reasons is the price point of entry has gotten quite a bit lower. So now you're seeing more DIY people on these cars. There are more smaller Porsche shops that are more focused on this generation Porsche servicing these. But we still do have these cars traded in quite a bit if somebody's looking at like a 991 for an upgrade. And I thought it would be a good time to just kind of revisit this car and share what we've seen in the past 12 months as common failure points on these cars. So we'll go and walk you through just what we're seeing commonly, and then also speak about some of the things that quote unquote a common issue, but we don't see them that much. On the 4 models, we do see quite a bit of the strut mount failure, and long story short, it's a rubber mount where the shock or strut attaches to the front of the chassis. And on these 4s, the strut is facing this angle, so here's where the wheel's at, and this is how the strut is versus the 2s, or that angle puts quite a bit of pressure on the strut, which causes premature failure of the rubber bushing. So not only does age kill it, but the angle kills it as well. So that's a pretty common repair we see on 4s. Usually we see 40 to 50,000 miles out of a new one before you have to replace it. Common problem we see, and we see some 996s and 997s because we use similar convertible systems, is the cylinder fail for the convertible top mechanism. There's quite a bit of leaks in the shock, the hydraulic shock. There is a couple of options. You can either have it rebuilt or have it replaced with a new one. A lot of people now with these cars, because the entry point is quite a bit lower than if it was 150 grand, opt for the rebuild service because it's quite a bit lower price to address this failure point that is getting to be more common on these. Here is the switches for the trunk and the front. Very common for this is to pop right out, or in some cases altogether the mechanism breaks. So this is a very common problem that we see. These cars tend to see a lot of wear on the buttons here. Basically it's like this rubber coating, and you can see this car actually has it and it becomes sticky. And there's a couple ways to handle this. You can replace the entire unit. Some people have like DIY methods where they'll use some sort of alcohol cleaner, remove all of it, and they'll spray paint them. And there's also some alternatives. I believe you can go on Amazon or eBay and actually buy the buttons, so you can take this thing apart and replace all the buttons. So it's kind of a common replacement that we see. We used to see this quite a bit on the 996. Your heater box would start to deteriorate and all the foam inside of it would come out of the vents here. Now we're seeing this on 997s. We haven't seen on 991s yet, but on 997s we are seeing some of the foam coming out of the heater box, so that is starting to become a problem we're seeing in our shop. Another problem that we've seen a few times is the cable here in the door, and basically how you know if you have a problem is right here. You'll pull this, and obviously this one has tension, right? But it'll have play in it, and usually that means the cable is stretched. If that happens, it's not too big of a fix. You will have to disassemble the door panel and replace the cable. Another thing I've seen at some points is I don't know if you can hear that when I pull this, how it drops the door here. Let's reset. But basically there's a sensor here, and what it does is it drops the glass. So when you open up the door, the glass goes in here. When you pull that, the sensor picks up that you're about to open the door and drops the glass, so it doesn't get a bind trying to open the door. So I have seen in some instances failure there. This is a new one, is we're actually seeing the LEDs in the cluster fail. I think that's just more of an age thing, but you'll just see distortion in the cluster in itself. Lastly, the PCM. As you can tell, this car has a new head unit in it. This was installed by the previous client. They wanted a little bit more modern feel. They didn't want to quite invest the money into a PCM Plus, so they went with this option. But the PCMs, it's not uncommon for those to fail. More of the common problems on this platform are kind of powertrain related. One being the air roll separator. That's pretty much been a common problem on 996, 997 for the M96, M97 engines for years now. So we still see it pretty frequently, and pretty much you'll notice quite a bit of smoke on startup. You may even notice if it gets to a point of pretty much complete failure, the car will have a rough idle. Another test is if you're not sure if it's leaking or failing, you can actually move this oil cap here while the car is running, and the car starts to run really poorly. So that's just kind of a couple signs that your air roll separator has failed, and that's pretty common on these cars. Another common problem that we don't necessarily classify as a common problem, because we have seen only 3 fail is the IMS bearing. On the 05 to 8 911s, for the S models, non-S models, basically non-GT cars, the IMS bearing has pretty much been blown out of the water. So I'm not going to get into the mud, so to speak, or the weeds for that in the details, but we don't typically see the engine failures come from these. What we do when we service these cars is we'll check camshaft deviation, and we'll check the oil filter housing, or the filter, cut it open, make sure there's no metal shavings in it, and then obviously look at the oil. And if we're not seeing any metal in the oil, camshaft deviation looks okay, there's no leaks coming from the IMS bearing, most of the time, you know, everything's okay. Now, we do offer a solution where we can do a direct feed system. Without getting to the details of it, is a quote-unquote lifetime solution for some of the clients that are more concerned with that failure. But overall, we don't see those fail hardly ever on these cars if those signs aren't there. Some other signs is you could hear a grinding noise, you could hear some additional engine noise, and a check engine light, because if the check engine light's triggered and you're hearing engine noise, grinding and whatnot, probably to the point of where it's pretty bad and the engine's going to have some heavy repairs. It will pick up a check engine light once it gets past a certain point, because the camshaft sensors are going to see quite a bit of deviation in the camshafts. I'm not even saying like common promises. A typical wear item is engine mount. They're rubber mounts, and one way you can kind of tell if a car needs it is you can actually look at the exhaust tip, and what happens is the engine will start to sag. This car, now there could be two scenarios with this car. These are somewhat adjustable, so there's some sagging here. So it could be just simply adjusting these, because I've seen these come out of adjustment over time. But another sign is the actual engine mount, which you can see right here as well. And this does look to be quite some age on it based on the corrosion there. It'll start to sag. So the rubber bushing will start to sag, and you'll notice the engine will start to sag. You'll also notice some vibration, other things, a little bit of deterioration in performance as well. Maybe even some clunking if it's really bad. So that's a pretty common problem, but it's not unusual for a car, especially that's 25 years old, to need engine mount, so it's not necessarily a flaw in the car, so to speak. And then this is pretty much typical with any car at some point in its life, is the water pump. Now, it's a little more common on these engines, and we have seen them fail as low as 30,000 miles, so it's a little bit of a soft spot on these cars. But at any point in time, a water pump can fail on any car. It's a little bit more common on these, so that is something that we see in the shop a good bit on these. You're basically looking anywhere from 30 to, I've seen as high as 100,000 miles on a stock water pump. Another thing that we see, again, more so, is just the nature of the beast, the clutches. Now, I will say it's a little bit of a soft spot on these cars, because we have seen clutches fail at 20,000 miles. When we've done some preventative IMS solutions on these cars, we have seen clutches that look like they're completely smoked at 20,000 miles. So that could be operation error, obviously, but we see it quite a bit more in these cars than we do in other cars. And generally, we also see the rear main seals leak on these cars. Now, both these components we're discussing are gonna be a failure in any car. If you put enough miles on any car, you're gonna have a rear main seal and you're gonna have a clutch fail. It is just more common in these cars to see it at an earlier time in the cycle, so to speak, of the component. So when you have a car that's 20 years old, a rubber gasket, you know, is gonna start to age, deteriorate, and rot. There is some inherent issues with the seal design itself in these cars. Again, when you're 20 years old, you're gonna have to do it at some point either way. Heavily discussed topic is bore scoring. Probably physically seen with my eyes, and I'm not a mechanic anymore by trade, but I still like to come out and see what common trends we're seeing is in the shop. It's the bore scoring, and I haven't seen a lot of cars have the issues with that yet, but it's discussed quite a bit. And typically what you'll have is signs that you're having an issue. Obviously you can hear some ticking noise, and then when you increase the revolutions of the engine or the RPMs of the engine, the ticking noise gets louder. You may notice some smoke at a certain point if it's gotten bad enough, and then obviously metal shavings in the oil. Now again, I don't see these too common with these cars, but there are certain shops that have seen way more issues than we have as well. So personally, we have not seen quite that many of those fail to the point where we actually dug into and found an issue. We would consider regular maintenance as the Coil Packs. Now there is a revised part number from Porsche on these Coil Packs. Generally speaking, any car 8 to 12 years old, 80 to 100,000 miles, Coil Packs are going to start to fatigue. But there was an issue with the design in these. Generally, how failure occurs in these is they become brittle, they become hard, they start to crack, and you've got the exhaust manifolds, you know, hovering over the cylinder heads here with a Coil Pack that's plastic. So you take a lot of heat, you take some plastic, you take some age, it's not uncommon for that to fail, but that is something that we do see a good bit more than other problems. And pretty much anytime one of these comes in, if they haven't been replaced, we go and recommend taking care of that, because at some point it will fail. Another area that we're starting to see quite a bit more than what we used to is valve cover leaks. Again, age. Sealant starts to fatigue, fail, you have leaks. So these valve covers are basically metal on metal with a lubricant or sealant, that Porsche basically specifically designed. You have to apply a thin bead. You have to use a certain material. If you don't use a certain material and apply it correctly, you'll have another failure with these. Another thing to consider while you're in that area, again, plastic tight compartments heat, we are seeing camshaft position sensors starting to become problematic as well. Not a super big deal, something you can take care of, relatively inexpensively. And then also the Vero camshaft seals are starting to develop leaks in these cars as well. And in some really rare cases, we have seen camshaft failure in the lifters. We had a client that had a 997 that was very high miles, 160,000 mile car, and had a misfire. And long story short, it went to several shops and they could never diagnose the problem. And what it ended up being, with some testing we did, is we were able to isolate the Verocam when it was activating. It was not lifting up because the lifter had fatigued. It wasn't increasing the lift as high as it should. And by doing some tests, we could determine that the actual lifters had failed and it was causing the engine to have a misfire. But at certain RPMs, it would have enough oil pressure for the car to operate like it was normal, but at low RPMs, it would idle very rough. Haven't really seen that in many cars. It's not necessarily a common problem, but we have seen it, and it's something that you could look at in a higher mileage car as being a potential problem. We have seen some instances as well with the starter cable and the starter failing. With some of the other problems, it's kind of an age thing, corrosion, time, use, so it's not too uncommon for those to fail in any cars at some point, but we do see those fail at some point. And then also the starter cable, we have seen quite a bit more of those failing due to corrosion in the cable and the car having difficulty starting or not starting at all. So with that being said, those are what I'd call more specific problems that you see with these cars are pattern problems. Again, when you get into a car that's 25 years old, you're going to start to see issues with components that are made of rubber or that have a lot of heat. It's just kind of nature of the beast. It's kind of law of physics. I don't think these are bad cars. I do think they have some inherent flaws or concerns. When you're looking at a car at this age, just realize that at one point it was a $100,000 car and it depreciated for a reason. Now, that's not to say that these cars haven't appreciate as well, but you're still going to have to do some restoration work at this cycle in the car's life. But overall, I think you can do some research. Obviously, you could do your due diligence and try to get one of these in great condition. It's just the nature of the beast. I probably may have missed a few small things, coolant hoses, PCV lines, stuff of that nature. That's all just a part of age and a car failing, components failing inside the car. But that's pretty much what we see on the powertrain side of things with these cars. Just look out for those things and do some due diligence, and just be prepared that when you're buying one of these cars, budget anywhere from $5,000 to $7,000 on any of these that you buy, because when people are selling these cars, in most cases they're not restoring these cars unless they're lower mileage examples. So it's just things that you may have to look out for at some point in ownership. So that was my overview of the common problems that we see on the 997s. Keep in mind, some of those problems we see frequently in the shop. Some of those problems are just inherent problems that are associated with these cars, and with these cars being 20 years old and soon creeping into 25 years of age, you're going to see these problems. It's just kind of normal. So don't take this as reasons not to buy this car. Just understand that this car was once $120,000. It is now 20 years older and it's gonna break. It's a machine, and it's just the nature of owning anything that is a machine. So these problems happen with Mustangs, Hondas, and Toyotas, but there's just probably not people investing a lot of money into a toy car that are documenting all these headaches and problems and doing the research that they are versus someone buying something like this. So overall, I think they're really good cars. I think the IMS issue is blown out of proportion. I think the bore scoring is blown out of proportion. And I think if you just service these cars and take care of them and just understand, there could be some hiccups along the way, I think it's a great option. And I do know for a fact that these cars are going to appreciate at some point to an astronomical price point, because it is the last of the analog Porsches. As you get into the 991, it's still somewhat analog, but this is pretty much the modern 993. So I like these cars a lot. In fact, pretty much every Porsche I've ever owned has been a 997, except for this one that is kind of breaking the rules a little bit. I'm a fan of these, and I hope this video gave you a ton of value. Hopefully it helps you prepare to buy the car that you actually want, and know that buying that car, you may have a few challenges, but overall these are great cars. If you have any questions, please comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.